While fast fashion offers consumers an opportunity to buy more clothes for less, those who work in or live near textile manufacturing facilities bear a disproportionate burden of environmental health hazards. So that's a quote from an article published in 2018. It's called The Global Environmental Injustice of Fast Fashion, and it was published with the BMC, if anyone's looking to read it. I read that article, and it's essentially telling us how bad the fashion industry is for both social and environmental justice. And on this week's episode, we're going to talk about how we got to this point.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about basically the history of fashion and its environmental ramifications, as well as its exploitation of people through history.
Yes.
Last week we did the design aspect of fashion, and then now we're kicking off 2 episodes where we talk really about the nitty-gritty, the bread and butter of sustainability issues in fashion. And as we mentioned last week, we're choosing fashion for this series because it's kind of often the forerunner of social change, and there's been a lot of attention placed on it when it comes to environmental issues, and kind of revolutionizing pretty much every industry is what we need to do if we want to successfully mitigate climate change. And we're both interested in fashion, so we just thought it'd be a good place to start. So I think what's going to happen is we will basically start in pre-ancient times?
Yes.
And then we'll run it all the way to about 1900. Alicia's going to be mostly delivering a chronology because she knows more about it than I do, and I'll just be jumping in where I can.
Jumping.
I'll just be jumping in where I can.
Cool. So I began my research literally just by looking at the history of dressing and seeing if there's ever been a society which didn't dress. And most anthropologists agree that since the dawn of time, people have been dressing in some way or another. They do it to cover up their weaknesses or to express their individuality. And it doesn't mean they wear clothes, but they might wear perfume, jewelry, body paint. But every single civilization, as far as we know, has dressed.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just kind of a disclaimer, because people might be wondering, but what about the people who don't dress? It doesn't apply to them if they exist somewhere.
Yeah.
In terms of fashion history, it began with just people essentially wearing clothes as a necessity. It's always been an expression of the individual. But for most of history, it was never fitted clothes. It would just be like a
Fabrics.
cloak, something wrapped around them, tunic, whatever. But it was very rarely fitted, so there was no standardization, no need for mass production, really. It was just you would get your cloak, and it would grow with you, change with you, and you'd just have it for your life. You'd wash it, just hang out probably when you're sleeping or something. But
and so that you didn't look like a ghost at Halloween, you would tie it around your body, right?
Yes.
Belts, straps, linen wraps.
Yeah.
So that you can move around, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Without getting trapped on brambles. I was just watching a video on medieval fashion, and they said, well, clothes were usually cut into squares or triangles to eliminate waste, and it's unpersonalized. It's just general. Yeah. It's oh, here's your square. Do with it what you will.
Yeah, exactly. And you would fashion in different ways. And of course, I'm going to say royalty throughout history has always had gold jewelry and adornments and more fancy stuff. But we're not really talking about royalty. We're just talking about the common person today.
Yeah, I was going to mention that because everything I looked into was almost all the lowest class.
Mm-hmm.
Just because royalty, it's they always play by their own rules.
Yeah.
And to me, it's less interesting and less relevant to today's times as well.
Yeah, because it doesn't really matter what the 1% is wearing.
Yeah, because they're only the 1%. It's not as big an impact.
Mm-hmm. So for most of human history, that's what people were wearing. But then during ancient Rome, ready-to-wear clothing started becoming a thing. Factories, essentially, were producing these standardized uniforms and pieces of clothing for the military.
Really, factories?
Well, sweatshops,
okay.
The slaves.
So no machines, just slaves working at it.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But you still weren't going to walk into a store and buy this. It would just be if you're in the military, you'd be issued this piece of armor and this tunic and these shoes and stuff like that. But that was the first time that people know of that things were made ready to wear. Earlier than that, people would there'd be maybe someone specialized in the community for producing their clothes. but it was still very local and not standard by any means.
When you say ready to wear, you mean mass produced?
Mass produced, yeah.
And it's funny that it
And
corresponds
standardized sizing.
with slave labor as well.
It always has. Yeah. I was trying to find examples of when maybe things are mass produced and not associated with slave labor, but it always has.
Well, it's oxymoron. Like it probably can't exist, because for something to be artisanal and made by any one person who cares about it, or any few people who care about it, it's like, it's not going to be mass produced like that. It's not going to all be ready to wear in the same uniform size and stuff.
Yeah. But there probably is a way to do it with machines that, like, you only need a few people to operate maybe, and then you can pay the people a living wage and make the conditions bearable, but no one's ever decided to really do that, except for a few.
We'll get into it.
Yeah. Anyway, so that was ancient Rome. And then between ancient Rome and the Industrial Revolution, some things started being produced en masse. So like stockings were produced. It's just things that are like stretchy and can kind of fit everyone. So stockings, gloves, hats, those types of things started being traded. And you'd go into a convenience store, your local market, and you'd be able to buy like a hat that was produced somewhere else. And the thing is with those, they're just much easier to produce en masse without being exploitative, I think, or without harming the environment, because they're so small.
Yeah.
And people would buy a hat that was ready to made, but it would be their hat for like their life.
That's true, and also people don't have numerous hats.
Yeah.
Or didn't.
Then the Industrial Revolution came around, and then this is when the exploitation of the land and the people just really ramped up, because, as we know, in America there was slave labor with cotton production, and they were producing like 90% of the world's cotton.
Wow.
And then some different places, some different European colonies were also producing cotton, and cotton's the most like water intensive crop that we use. And right now, and since the Industrial Revolution, pretty much all fabric has either been made out of cotton or polyester, which is made out of oil.
Why is that? Why is
cheap.
Cotton's cheap? Because was that just a seed?
Yeah.
So what are the historical alternatives? I know there's like susty technological fabrics right now, which might be better for the environment and labor, but what are the like historical natural alternatives to cotton which are better?
Linen probably is the biggest one.
What's linen?
Linen is made out of flaxseed.
Flax?
Yeah.
Wow. And that's less water intensive, huh?
Yeah. And then hemp is also an option, which it feels very similar to linen. But those are probably the two most historical, like sustainable ones, but they take more to grow and produce. Cotton's just really easy. And because there's all of these
Take more time, you mean?
Yeah. And I think because cotton has these institutions of exploitation set up, maybe it might not even be the most economical, but because it's like so cheap to produce because there's so many people working in this industry.
Maybe it's just the first one that people found.
I think so.
Or the Europe found, should I say.
Yeah.
Even before industrialization, I was looking into the fashion of medieval Europe, just because that was the first era which came to mind, and I wanted to jump to specific times just as kind of case studies or inflection points along the line. And yeah, most of their clothes were made out of wool or linen. Most of them, as I mentioned, were just squares or triangles or strips. One thing I found interesting, and not so much environmental, was that even, because this is contrary to what I was taught, even poor people had brightly colored clothing, but it's just that the dyes on poor people didn't last very long, because they were like weaker natural dyes, and they weren't reinforced with, that's a thing that you have to like mix it with so that it lasts, and that was probably what was expensive. But that was just interesting to me, because they were all, it was basically what you could find, so like different plants or tree roots or stuff or whatever you find in the natural world which can make your clothes red. But it's just funny because I was always taught that it was just rich people who had like brightly adorned clothes.
Yeah.
When that wasn't necessarily the case. It was more that those dyes were more permanent. Which I thought there was some kind of interesting parallel to be made today about class and clothes, but I wasn't sure what it was, because today it's like everyone has clothes whatever color you want.
There's been a lot of counter arguments when I'm trying to find like the unsustainability of modern fashion, and it's people saying, well, now like everyone has access to fashion, like you can dress basically the same as someone who is really rich.
Mm-hmm.
They might just be of a lesser quality, I
Oh,
suppose.
I think the interesting parallel to be made is that now it's natural dyes and raw stuff, which is way more expensive.
True.
That's the funny point. I think it's just basically flipped.
Yeah.
Like you have to, as we mentioned last week, you have to pay for that authenticity. There's a premium to like better quality natural clothes.
Yeah.
Better made stuff.
Talking about dyes, I have an interesting story about using natural dyes. So like Scottish tartans?
The red and blue and
Yeah, so like
squares.
each clan would have their own tartan.
Oh yes.
But I learned that's like super modern. Like it was the case, but it would just be people would essentially, the territory that clan occupied, they would use the berries and the dyes that they had in that area, and that's how you'd identify them. But it wasn't this like super strict like woven pattern that we see today. And that's kind of cool. That was like literally just developed for tourism.
That's
which
very
is
interesting.
Kind of funny.
This is like a localized identity, culture, which is obviously now just completely evaporated with globalization. And there's a question of whether that's a good or bad thing for tribalism or for identity, but we can definitely say that it has come along with a lesser sustainability of production and distribution of clothes. Whether it's caused that, whether it's, just correlated, but that's definitely a thing. Keeping with the medieval stuff, the most interesting thing I found was the presence of silk in their clothes.
Okay.
Silk was kind of like the rarest and richest fabric, and so much so that it was basically reserved for like very rich people or church ceremonies or decorations. And it was imported from either Byzantium, which is I think modern day Turkey, or the Far East, India or China. And I thought this is maybe one of the first examples of, like offshore production of clothes and that being kind of vaunted and desired.
Yeah.
Which now we have today for the opposite reasons, because those clothes are actually cheaper.
Yeah.
But it's
for sure.
Obviously their travel and their shipping then wasn't huge, like,
It'd be like
fossil
one
fuel
ship.
producing emissions, but it was still, that was the beginning of this, which we now find such an awful practice.
Yeah. I found it interesting when I was reading about this, the proportion of imports that were textile based.
Yeah.
For as long as basically globalization has been around, or trading across oceans has been around, it's been like 50% or more of the shipment would be textiles.
Well, yeah, that's why Europeans largely were so interested in North America, right? Or rather, that's what they could get out of the indigenous peoples, was clothes which would allow them to survive the winters here.
Yeah, basically. It's just like I feel like that's so excessive from the get-go.
Yeah.
You went from having one piece of clothing or like 3 dresses for your whole life, and then now you have like something for every season and like a bunch of different outfits. It was just like a really quick shift, I think.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of, this might be a little bit off topic or random, but I was watching a cooking show the other day with my family, and they were talking about the introduction of spices from India. And it was like, because me, when I heard that in school about colonization, I was like, why were Europeans so obsessed with spice? Like, why was that more expensive than gold? Why was that such a valued commodity?
Yeah.
And it's because to someone who'd always just had relatively bland food with none of that kind of flavors, it was mind blowing to them, and it reached like a mythological status.
Yeah.
And then it's like once they tried it, they just wanted more of it. And you can see how that really affected the economy. And I think clothes might be similar.
That
It's
makes
like,
a lot of sense.
well, you've had all this kind of mundane linen, and okay, it's dyed, but that washes off really quickly, and none of it's fitted, and none of it's interesting, and it all looks the same.
Then all of a sudden you can like really stand out if you just have this one piece, like these 3 pieces. That's a good point. So I was wondering, like, why hasn't the world just revolved around food? Because like, wouldn't you think importing like potatoes would be more important than importing spices? But it's just, you just kind of cleared that up in my brain.
You mean food rather than flavors, or food rather than clothes?
Food rather than flavors or clothes.
Right, because, well, that's kind of interesting. You mentioned potatoes, so it means like, why aren't people more interested in nutrition than they are in like flavors?
Yeah.
And it's also the case, you mentioned the cotton industry with slaves in the US. the sugar plantations. Like that was another huge part of the economy.
Yeah.
It's like, well, sugar's not a necessary nutritious ingredient. Why is that such a huge thing? It's this decadence which seems to go along with expansion and colonization. It's like, well, yeah, none of this is necessary, but it would all taste nice
Yeah.
and it would all look nice.
Yeah.
Very
So just
cool.
want to get it as cheap as possible and in as much excess as possible and
Yeah.
in abundance as possible. Yeah.
And that's like a philosophy, I think, which hangs around today and is even more institutionalized today, even from a younger age.
I
It's like,
think so.
you know, we're addicted to sweets and nice clothes, or many clothes, should I say.
Yeah.
Another little case study I had was, and I think this is where I want to introduce this question, which I thought we could frame the whole discussion around,
Okay.
was the indigenous peoples of North America. I know it's like a huge continent, and so they had many different geographies, animals, and plants from which they made their clothes.
Yep.
But just some common themes were animal furs or tanned animal skins from North American mammals such as buffalo, bison, deer, antelope, and then for like smaller pieces or decorations, rabbits, beavers, minks, things like that. As well as there were some plant products woven from natural fibers or even from animal hairs, as well as like bone and shell ornaments, because something that characterized, I think, North American indigenous culture and probably most indigenous cultures around the world was that they used the whole animal. You know, that was a tenet. It's like, let's not waste. And also, it's been well documented and well talked about, and it's kind of like a favorite topic of, I think, sustainable discussions, is the fact that indigenous cultures tended to have such a more forward-thinking approach than do we in the West today.
Yeah.
As in, let's only take what we need, you know, let's plant a tree. As we take one, let's ensure that we can keep living. So I wanted to discuss that in relation to clothes in a world of 8 billion.
Okay.
Because we like to kind of put that way of living on a pedestal and say, that was so awesome, it was sustainable. And I was like, would that be sustainable today? Could everyone do that today? Because it seems to me it was like a lot of animal pelts being worn and stuff. And I was like, could everyone do that today?
I think we've kind of cut down animal populations to a point that we certainly couldn't. But we could definitely all just have like a couple things that
Do you think?
I think so.
Because it's funny because like most sustainable groups tend to be along the, I know this is a little bit of animal rights as well, but look down on or condemn someone for wearing like a beaver pelt on their head. I wouldn't, but I just thought that was interesting.
No, I know what you mean though. Because I want to say it was Greenpeace who was like super fighting against people living in like the north of Canada, Northern Territories. They were fighting against them hunting seals.
Yeah.
Or like it's against the law
That's
to
similar.
hunt seals, but they would literally just like hunt a seal, use it all. So there's just no issue with that if you're using it all, respecting it, and not hunting them in excess. Like those laws were put into place against whale hunting and seal hunting to stop like people who were like poaching them and just going crazy and using like these crazy machines. But if you're going out with like your spear, your fishing line to catch a couple fish, like that's different than someone going out with
Do you think that's fine though for 8 billion people to do?
I think so.
You think that would work?
Yes.
That was kind of the key question for me. It's like, does that way of life actually translate well into a world as big as it is today and as populated?
I think so, because it just goes hand in hand with the appreciation for what's around you and for your fellow human and for nature.
Yeah. I just wondered if population had exceeded a way that would actually be in balance.
I don't know.
It was the other comparison I drew was with diet, because I know like most First Nations cultures weren't vegetarian.
Yeah.
I don't think any of them were. It was like, well, there was a lot of hunting of mammals and the local wildlife to eat. And you mentioned the seal hunting. And yet it seems to be a commonly held opinion from vegetarians and vegans today that such a way of life isn't sustainable. And I just wanted to...
You just wanted to kind of bring up that point to think about, thinking, is vegetarianism the only way?
Well, put it this way, like 2 weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we had our episode on activism. And I said the quote that you should all act how you think everyone needs to act for things to be sustainable.
Yeah.
And I was just questioning how do we all need to act for things to be sustainable, be it with fashion, be it with food, like how much can we consume
Mm-hmm.
in a world of 8 billion for everything to be in balance? Is
Yeah.
that...
I think the thing is with the 8 billion, maybe we couldn't each be hunting our own meals. I think there's a degree of efficiency that's going to be needed,
Mhm.
but I think meat can still be consumed, but more as a spice than a potatoes.
More as a spice.
Yeah.
I don't think I
I know
want
you
to try
don't
your
like that.
food.
Well, what we had for dinner last night, the bacon was the spice, and the tofu was like the chunk, and you don't like tofu, but, you know.
It was just this... Okay, like today's clothes is like factory made with polyester and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And even a lot of eco fabrics, which I see, are not something that me or you could make,
Mm-hmm.
like maybe it was in medieval times. It's still very like factory technological advancements.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same with meat. Most kind of lower emission alternatives to meat are like, who knows what's in them, because they're very kind of jammed with weird stuff.
Yes.
It's like a scientific concoction rather than anything else. And with clothes, it's like all these polyesters and stuff, but maybe like an eco polyester or something. I was just wondering, is that the only way, or can we go back to, as we described in medieval times, you have your sheep, you take off the
Shear
wool,
them, yes.
you shear them, you spin that, you all wear it, maybe you dye it with natural stuff. But I was like, okay, that seems fine when the world was smaller and there were fewer people, but is that
Mm-hmm.
still doable today if everyone is doing that? Is that still a lifestyle which everyone can share? Was my
Okay.
question.
I see. I'm going to say no.
You don't think so?
Because as we always talk about, like, I don't think in the perfect, sustainable, degrown world, there's going to be no manufacturing. I think the manufacturing will be there. Like, if you're a clothing manufacturer, your mission statement would be keeping people warm.
But then there might be like this issue retained of this fundamental disconnect between me buying my clothes.
But, like, what if they're just producing the fabrics? And then
I don't
you
know.
sew them, you knit. Because I think the raw
Materials.
have to be processed to an extent before we can maybe get them and make them ourselves. Because everyone can't have, all 8 billion of us can't have a spinning wheel.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah. Okay. We know that there's going to be like an emphasis on community. So there would be maybe one person in the community who's really into that. So they would be the one spinning the wool. Then everyone would take their wool home and knit it or whatever.
Yeah.
I think you have to iron out the details of that.
I just think that's the question which everyone involved with lowering their own emissions or their community's emissions need to ask. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
what's possible?
Yeah.
On a global scale. And the resolution which I had for the question was that it's so big, like a mathematical proposition to even try and begin to answer that question.
Yeah.
As to almost be like a matter of faith rather than of science.
Yeah.
The question of acting how you think everyone needs to act. It's like, it's way too big a question to try and figure out scientifically, mathematically, how everyone needs to act. So it's almost just like a guesswork.
Yeah, you just have to kind of hope you're backing the right horse.
Yeah.
So next in history, so I said a little bit about the Industrial Revolution. That's kind of what we were talking about. How can we maybe, if we were to be back at the splitting point of Industrial Revolution, maybe what's another road we could have taken? But some of the biggest outcomes of that were just the rapid change in style. So pre-Industrial Revolution, something would come into style, so say like a really tight corset and then like a big bustle on your dress. And that would stay around for like 10 years or more. But then after the Industrial Revolution, the thing is, if you wanted to be kind of stand outish, you'd have to be constantly changing your styles.
Yeah, and that was possible now because things were manufactured so quickly, right?
Yes.
And distributed well.
Mm-hmm. And what happened with that is they also started really simplifying what we're wearing. So that's when people started wearing just more like straight line skirt, like fewer layers, I guess, is the thing.
Fewer clothes.
Yeah, fewer clothes.
T-shirts.
And then that just kind of ramped up really quickly, and now we're wearing spaghetti
Nothing.
straps and like short shorts. Yeah, that's kind of was the turning point, and from people dressing really ornately, no matter who they were, really, like you would always, even if you were just a like stay-at-home mom, you'd still wear like layers and like
Mm-hmm.
have your smock and your hat and your everything like that.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to return to this question. Maybe it's more doable for everyone to be spinning their own clothes now because we all wear less fabric.
Yeah, because we have heat.
Yeah, it's like, well, maybe if everyone were wearing like the huge dresses and suits and stockings all the time, as in medieval times or Victorian times,
Mm-hmm.
maybe that wouldn't be doable for everyone to make now. But if everyone's just wearing like short shorts and t-shirts, as you mentioned, so yeah, that's only like a fifth of the fabric.
Good point. Like your sister's crocheting a tank top right now.
And also things are warming up, unfortunately, but it's happening.
Yeah, it is happening. um, so the garment industry in the 1800s, still everyone was wearing Victorian garments, but it was being produced in factories now in just these wretched conditions. There was like cotton dust in the air. The cotton is super water intensive to grow, but also to dye. I'm not entirely sure why. Like I think you just have to, like when you make dye, you mix it with water.
Yeah, I think most things
Soak
are.
it in. Yeah, so it's just insanely water intensive. And it says women and children were working 12 to 20-hour days and being paid essentially nothing. And so this is when like fast fashion ready to wear started happening, and again, super closely tied with exploitation of labor. But the thing is, in the Victorian era, the production and manufacturing, or like the processing, was happening in the United States and in Europe. But now we're like exporting it, so we don't see it. And it kept happening in the United States and in Europe until the early 1900s, when people started to kind of realize, oh, our clothing is being produced in these factories where kids are like literally dying. And then there were a bunch of protests, and in 1911 it was called like the Triangle Shirt House Factory in Pennsylvania. There was a fire, and the thing is, the owners of the factory had like literally just locked kids in rooms so they couldn't get out. And then there were like 1,800 people who died
Wow.
in this fire. And so this is when labor rights got really strict, which is obviously a good thing.
1911.
1911, I believe. Let me have to
Well,
look this paper.
My initial reaction to that is like, probably people were up in arms about like, oh, these kids are dying, but as long as it's out of sight, out of mind, we still, and it has a swoosh on it, like a Nike swoosh. No one still really
It's
cared that much.
It's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
But like, I didn't know that things are made in in sweatshops until I was
A teenager.
And
then
it's
did you
like,
stop buying and wearing that completely? No,
not
it's
completely. It's just like every time I've bought something from like Gap or Nike, I always just like, I don't know what makes me make that decision. But like, you still make the decision. It's so ingrained in us.
in some cases it's because I find there's no alternative. It's like if you want to buy something sporty, it's like, what?
I literally can't afford like sustainably made sneakers because they're like $500.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, I'll buy these like $30 pair from Winners, but it was made in a sweatshop. It's hard. Yeah, it was 1911 Triangle Shirt House fire. 146 killed, but there was another fire after that there were 1,800 killed, and so people started protesting, and then there were regulations like children weren't allowed to work anymore. They had to work for like just a few hours a day. But then things started getting exported because labor got more expensive in North America and in
with
Europe.
all the regulations.
Yes.
As well.
In terms of like fast fashion, there was kind of another step that I wanted to mention. There's this store called Marshall Fields, which I'm guessing is like modern day Marshalls. And they like...
Probably not, but...
No, I feel like it is.
Okay.
I'm going to say it's like what Winners and Marshalls is. Sure. And they started producing like standardized women's wear, and it was available for $621 instead of, if you got it like from the designer, it'd be $1,864. So like it was half the price, less than half the price. So this was the first like when department stores started like ripping off designers and selling it for cheaper. Is essentially that. But it was still super expensive. Like that's 621 like modern day dollars. So you'd still keep it around and mend it.
Yeah.
And until the 1930s, fashion magazines weren't just saying, here, shop at these stores. They were giving you like the patterns to make your own clothing.
Mm-hmm.
So until, the 1930s, it was still very like make your own clothes, or you're going to spend $621 to buy it from a department store.
Yeah.
So you're going to obviously keep it around for a bit.
This thing about consumer stores basically mimicking like designer designs
Yeah.
is that it seems like there's no way to do it sustainably because the price is always going to be way down, and to do that, you have to cut costs on materials and labor,
Exactly.
like insanely so.
Yeah.
But that seems like, on the surface, it's like, well, that's a great way of making, as you mentioned earlier, everyone dresses the same, and there's no longer this like visual barrier between class, and now poor people can dress like they're rich.
Yeah, and like on the surface that obviously seems great,
Yeah.
but it's like if it's coming at the expense of other human lives and of the environment, it's just not worth it.
Here's my solution to that. There is no like Louis Vuitton sold to people like for $1,500 a t-shirt.
Right.
But Louis Vuitton or whatever the label can still have its runway, can still have its seasons and its designs, because that's how a lot of people express their creativity. You know, fashion is art. We mentioned that last week. And also for consumers, like they're fun to watch.
Exactly.
It's fun to follow, even if maybe it can be without this classism aspect of I'll never be able to afford that.
Yeah,
So,
or I'm going to spend my entire life trying to be able to afford
good
that.
point. So those things can exist as art pieces more than product catalogs. Maybe like say, okay, you guys can do this thing, but don't sell your clothes. And then everyone else to whom these shows are being broadcast, it's like, well, here are your designs. Go and make what you want, you know?
Yeah, and then everyone can be unique, and maybe they buy their fabric from like the local fabric store where it's produced or whatever, but then they can dye it like their shade of blue for the season,
Yeah.
and then they can take inspiration from the cuts and stuff.
I know it's an epic pipe dream, but that's
know.
kind of like our utopia for a degrowth society.
Yeah.
And
It's where like things are sold to us as art, not as consumer products.
yeah, well, given,
Yeah, not sold, but like, yeah, broadcast to us.
Just one last thing I wanted to mention. We've talked about it excessively, but we didn't go in depth. We say there's always this correlation between where there's environmental exploitation, there tends to be exploitation of labor.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned it with cotton, and I said it was silk as well.
Yes.
And modern day sweatshops.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to ask, why is that? What's the psychological drive which makes us want that Nike hoodie, even though we know that it's bad for the environment and bad because of the conditions of the people who had to make it?
I think it's probably just all boils down to convenience.
Yeah.
Because it's easier to just wear like a whole set from this brand than to have to worry about like making your own or trying to put together pieces in a way that are cool. Because whenever people wear like Champion sets, like with a, fanny pack and everything, everyone's like, whoa, so cool. But it's just like they literally just like ripped that off the rack. Like,
yeah,
there's no actual style associated with it, but it's so easy.
I think it's something about when fashion becomes not about the aesthetics and more about the class.
Yes.
Because what you're saying, okay, that person, you would call them a bad dresser, other people would call them a good dresser because the outfit looks cool because it's Champion branded. What you would call a good dresser is someone, even if the clothes were cheap and thrifted, if they demonstrated a knowledge of fabric, coordination, proportion, things like that, you'd say, wow, good job.
Yes.
So maybe if we could make more widespread that attitude towards fashion aesthetics, more of an appreciation towards skill, I guess you would call it, artistry or something.
Good eye.
But also, there needs to be a way that we can deconstruct these institutions of branding, or as we mentioned earlier, silk coming from Asia, which people, like the class aspect of it.
Yeah.
That's integral to the unsustainability of it, I think, because it's by its nature not localized, and also, I mean, it's uniform across people, which we don't like.
I think we can maybe normalize having a hand in making your own clothing, or at least having a hand in like, the person someone involved in it, because right now I know no one in the like manufacturing industry.
Yeah.
And so if we knew a person who was working in one of these shops where there was like cotton dust in the air and the water they were drinking was polluted by the dye that the factory they work.
Expose those stories, you mean?
Yeah.
And ask people the question, what's the alternative? You know, what else?
Mm-hmm.
Where else should we go as a society? And I think the answer would, or the only answer is local.
Yeah.
And sustainable, or rather, local and well made. Because
Yes.
the other thing about those medieval clothes is that they lasted a long time. Like they lasted a longer time than they do now.
Exactly.
So when they had a hole, you patched them. And
Yeah.
now it's like when clothes have a hole, well, I could spend the time and money to patch this and probably have to learn the skill because it's not
Mm-hmm.
something that we all know anymore. But it might be cheaper. It was only an $8 sweater. Maybe it'll be cheaper just to get another one.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, like, what would happen if all of a sudden we just started, yeah, we still shop at H&M, but we, like, buy this sweater and keep it for, like, 16 years.
Well, I don't think
They would just go out of business.
Who, H&M?
Yeah, because they just rely on people buying clothes
Yeah,
mindlessly, I
but
suppose.
it's also kind of like the planned obsolescence of iPhones, where it's like
Yeah.
H&M don't make their clothes to last. They make
No.
it kind of like restaurants putting salt in the drinks so that you come back for more drinks.
Yeah.
That's what H&M does. It's like, well, one, they deliberately create this rapid cycle of style. So it's like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to keep wearing these pants. I want more ones because these ones aren't in style this year.
Mm-hmm.
And also, these fabrics have all gone all funky. The t-shirt doesn't fit anymore. It's all weird. So I need a new one.
Yeah, true. So quality.
Quality over quantity is a huge thing. We're going to be talking about basically how we think building a good wardrobe works.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll talk about that more in episode 4. But just from a historical perspective, the idea of people wearing patched clothes today seems a little bit more kind of far-fetched, and especially if it was someone of means, someone who I would call like on the wealthier side of things.
Mm-hmm.
If they wore like a really patched outfit, or maybe not everything looking incredibly pristine, or even in style, I think we'd judge them.
I think so.
I think we'd say, why are you dressing like that?
Yeah.
So that's another paradigm which I think needs to be changed. And I do think that's changing because when I look at like the sustainable kids on our campus, everything's patched.
Yeah. And they're the ones that are kind of setting the trends. As we kind of wrapped up on last week's episode, we think thrifting's coming into style, so maybe patching's coming into style, which is good.
Natural dyes as well.
Yes. So thanks everyone for listening. This was a really fun episode. Once again, I'm excited for next week and hope you enjoyed this and learned something.
Yeah, next week we're going to be talking more about the modern side of unsustainable practices in fashion, that being like global shipping and how much we all wash our clothes and the modern materials used. And if you're interested in listening to us talk more about fashion, art, culture, the environment, or everything in between, you can find us on Instagram at @the_environmental, where we post neat graphics, behind the scenes images, and quotes related to those things. Hope you all have a great day, and see ya.